Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 39. And this episode is all about Windows Terminal. And I am a huge fan of the CLI and also a Windows user. But sadly, historically, the Windows command line experience has been a bit, shall we say, pants. And I think back to even when pasting into the clipboard was a really bad experience. So I used to reach for tools like Commander or ConMU and things. But these past few years, I've been using the new Windows Terminal, which is amazing. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. So I am very excited to be joined by Kayla Cinnamon, who is the program manager at Microsoft, delivering both Windows Terminal and Cascadia Code, which we can also talk about. And she's the host of Windows Wednesday and is also working on the Windows Developer Experience. So welcome to the show, Kayla. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. So could you introduce yourselves to listeners and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. So I am a program manager at Microsoft, and my main products are Windows Terminal as well as Cascadia Code, as you mentioned, which is the font that's inside Windows Terminal. And then lately we've been working on just improving the overall developer experience on Windows and trying to make sure that that's as nice as possible and ways we can improve it there too.
Awesome. Well, I used to use many years ago another one, Fira Code, and then I moved over to Cascadia Code. And for both of them, just the whole ligatures thing, I always like it when doing a talk or something and you're showing code and you forget the ligatures exist when you get used to it. But then you always get people in the audience saying, what's going on with your fonts? What's going on with the greater recall to this sign? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I've always been a fan of ligatures, and it's cool that they work in Terminal too, because they don't in the original console. So that's an improvement there.
Was that an easy thing to get in? Or I'm aware that I'm a user of the Windows Terminal, but I'm guessing there's lots and lots of complications under the hood with the implementation detail.
Yeah, so I'm not a developer, but our terminal has a custom text renderer. So we are kind of modifying everything by hand compared to the original text buffer and legacy console. So adding the ligatures was just part of I believe it was part of the UTF-8 inclusion where we can have emojis and things. I might need to be corrected on that, but I believe that's part of the same underlying architecture.
So just to pick up on what you just said then, we can put emojis in the Windows Terminal.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I think now you've mentioned it, I do remember hearing that, but I've just never used it myself. But I think from now onwards, I'm going to start doing that and putting emojis everywhere.
Yeah, just name all of your folders and files with emojis and then have them display in your terminal.
Awesome. So before we dig deeper into Windows Terminal, I'm just going to quickly do this episode's listener mentions. And there's two this time. And the first one goes to Sergey Werazingham. And he tweeted out, "This might be my favorite .NET podcast episode ever. Clifford Aegis has done some life-changing things in IoT." And then the second one goes to Hannah Price, who's referring to the same episode, who tweeted out, "Welling up hearing about Clifford Aegis' life-changing IoT work on the Unhandled Exception podcast. Eye-opening and incredible." And they are both referring to the last episode where I was joined by Clifford to chat about .NET MAUI, IoT, and also the 3D printed prosthetic arm he's built, which has been life-changing for young Caden, who was born without a left arm and a left hand. And Clifford's arm, which has been nicknamed Handy, has allowed Caden to pursue his dream of becoming a chef, which is absolutely amazing. So a massive thank you to both Sergey and Hannah for your tweets. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag #UnhandledException. And all feedback is greatly appreciated. And I'm Dracan on Twitter, which is DRACAN. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. So going back to Windows Terminal, so we should probably take a step back and talk about what it is, because we don't really want to confuse, because it's not replacing PowerShell or Bash or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So could you just give like an elevator pitch of what, as in just so the listeners actually understand what it actually does for us?
Yeah, so Windows Terminal is basically the new user interface for command line applications on Windows. So if you were to go into your command prompt in your PowerShell today, and go to the property sheet of each one, you'll notice that they're identical. And that's because the code that is putting the text on the screen is the same for each one. So they're both using the same UI, which we call console host or con host. And that is now being updated to Windows Terminal. So Command Prompt and PowerShell are still using the same UI. It will just be in Windows Terminal instead. So it's not a new shell. It's just a new box around the shell that's running.
So it's almost like a Windows manager, which if I think about functionality that I like with it, is things like having tab support or split screen. So you can have, quite often I would have, if I'm developing and running an application locally, which has a front end, like a Blazor front end or React or whatever, and also an API, I open Windows Terminal, split the screen, and have .NET running in one window, and then like basically both projects running in different windows. So I can just have it in a second monitor and see the streams from both separately. And just being able to have the same window, but two panes is really, really nice. And also the tab support as well, just all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely our favorite feature is tabs.
Yeah, definitely. Just things like, as I mentioned at the start with, if you think about like the old CMD, I'm probably going back quite a few years now because for a long time I've used like a Windows manager, like I mentioned Commander, and now for the past few years I've used Windows Terminal. But if I think back a long time ago using the native CMD and even using the clipboard, having to right click, I think was it the Mark submenu, and then you got to go paste, so you can't just Control C and Control V.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just little things like that which make it a really nice experience.
Yeah, Control C is a tricky one too, because that's like the exit command in terminals. So when we first added or copy paste as actions or key bindings in a terminal, we bound them to Control Shift C and Control Shift V, because Control C is used in terminals and Control V is used in some Bash terminals as well. But then we got a lot of feedback saying just make it Control C and Control V. So now if you have a selection in terminal, it'll copy. Otherwise, it'll send the exit command. And then Control V if we just bound by default. So you can remove those if you need them for your terminal or keep them for copy and paste.
I feel really dumb now because I've never actually mentally clicked about the control. I use Control C to cancel a process all the time.
Yeah.
I guess thinking about the way I use the clipboard in the terminal, most of the time it's pasting I'm doing, not the copying bit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, now you mention it, it's obvious. Like, yeah, Control C is both of those things. So that makes sense. The initial, as you say, Control Shift bindings.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I really like about Windows Terminal is the flexibility of theming. And I know, like, because I follow you on Twitter, and I quite often see various different funky customizations and things. So what's been your favorite? I know this is really hard in an audio podcast, but out of all the funky customizations you've seen.
So I'm always a fan of background images in Terminal, but that's been around since like 0.3 or 0.4. Like that's been around for a while. Some of the newer customizations that I really like are, we call it traditional opacity, but when we first shipped Terminal, you could get opacity, but it was with the acrylic material in the background. So it was still blurry and you couldn't see clearly the text behind the terminal window. Now we've added traditional opacity, which mirrors the opacity that you can have in the original console window, where you can just have it, go less opaque or more transparent, and it will be not blurred. So you can still see the text behind the window. So that's a feature that I like in terms of like customization. And along the same lines, a community member added acrylic title bar. I personally like that one a lot because it looks a lot like the launch video that we made in 2019 with that glassy title bar effect. I feel like the acrylic material in the title bar gives it a very similar look, which I'm a fan of. So that was a pretty cool addition to see come through.
Now you've mentioned that launch video. That is something I was going to bring up, but that is absolutely amazing. That's the best promotional video I've ever seen for a command line. I can't do it just explaining it, but imagine like how would you explain it?
Kind of like the Super Bowl commercial of terminals. Like it's
I remember the first time I saw that. So a user group I run, .NET Oxford, that evening we had a lightning talk session. And one of the, I can't remember, so it was Stuart Leeks doing a lightning talk. And I can't remember, I think it was WSL, one of the WSLs. But he was also showing Windows Terminal as part of his talk. And he showed that video. And I remember at the start of the event, Stuart said to me, "Can I hook my laptop into the sound system?" Because it was like a proper sound system with all like stereo sound and like surround sound. So I thought, yeah, I guess so, but I didn't know why. And he played that, so that was the first time I did it. But bear in mind that was like in a proper setup with a big massive screen and surround sound, and it was just incredible. It was like being at the cinema. And to the listeners that don't know what I'm talking about, just look at the show notes and just watch it. But put decent headphones on when you do.
Yeah, the song is pretty good.
I like it at the end as well, where it shows, is it all the developers that have worked on it when it quickly scrolls through all the names?
Yeah, so in the where your username, your like Windows username would go in your file path, we put everyone's like Microsoft alias who was on the team at the time, and they flick by really quickly at the end. That's a little Easter egg.
So have I given it away now?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I don't think a lot of people noticed it, so then they go back and they're like, "What? I never saw that. Like, that's so cool." So, I think we did it by seniority or like length of time on the team or something. So I think I'm last because I just joined like 3 months before that video. So, yeah.
Do you know how long the whole video took?
We started it in maybe end of March, early April, and then it aired May 6th that year. So about a month and a half.
That's not too bad.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before about backgrounds as well, and I think you said animated backgrounds, but I suppose because that was skipped over. Well, I don't know whether you did mention it, but I do know that you can put animated backgrounds in Windows Terminal, which is kind of, this just feels like so much more like than a terminal. It's amazing.
Yeah, you can have GIF support or GIF, depending on what side of the fence you're on that one. But yeah, it supports GIFs. And I think there's a feature request out for MP4 support. We haven't gotten around to that one, but yeah.
I feel like it needs a Netflix plugin.
Yeah. just watch videos in your terminal instead of using it as a terminal.
Oh, that's so funny. That reminds me, I was seeing on Twitter, was it the other week, where everyone was it in Stranger Things 4? And because we said Netflix, so my mind jumped over to that. But someone discovered that there was C# code.
Oh, yeah.
On one of the screens in Stranger Things 4.
Yeah, I saw pictures of that. I haven't watched it yet. I'm behind, but yeah, I saw pictures of that.
Yeah, I believe there was lots of compilers in there, so that was on Twitter. That was just being picked apart left, right, and centre, but that was quite funny.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a tangent, but so as a developer, I use Git quite a lot. And I must admit, I do favour GUIs for Git. I'm a big CLI fan, but for Git, I probably use GUIs more. But I do try and use Git on the command line as well, just so I'm comfortable with both. So I use Posh Git when I'm on the command line, which gives additional stuff, so you can see what branch you're on and how many commits you're behind and all that kind of stuff. So that's super useful. So that works really well with Windows Terminal. And I know is it Oh My Posh for PowerShell, and I never know how to pronounce this, but there's Oh My Zoosh as well, ZSH, which allows you to like really customize the command line. And that prompt where if you're using Posh Git, you can get some Git stuff, but you can customize that with lots of other stuff as well. So your command prompt, you can just get loads of extra information. And I know, again, like watching your Twitter feed, you can have seen all sorts of different customized.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Oh My Posh. I use it, and it's like the first thing I set up after I get terminal. It's like my background image and my Oh My Posh. And what's cool about Oh My Posh is that you can have different components or extensions, or I'm not quite sure the name, or plugins or something, but you can customize what's in that prompt, and there's a ton of different options. So I think the one that I use has like Spotify included, so I can see the song I'm listening to in my terminal, which is cool, but only if I'm playing music on Spotify. So it handles that pretty well, but that's a cool thing you can have.
I saw a talk by Scott Hanselman, and because he has to monitor his blood sugar levels. when he was doing the demo, he had in his command prompt, he actually had his current blood sugar level as part of the prompt, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So with all these customizations and different themes and everything, is there a central place where these can be shared? Or so you can like look at a gallery of different customizations, or is it just people throw them in their own GitHub?
So there's no central place for terminal themes that is like sponsored by Microsoft or anything like that, but I know community members have made them. So one of them that I've seen is terminalsplash.com, and that looks like it has a bunch of color schemes, and then you could go to the source and copy the background image as well. And that's all on GitHub, so I believe you can just make a pull request to that and it gets added in. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm trying to quick look at it. So each theme seems to have a code and a source button. And if you click code, you get a pop-up with the code in there, which you can just copy. But if you click on the source, it takes you to the source GitHub that particular theme was about.
Right. So it looks like most of these just have the color scheme, which is just a JSON snip, but you can add the background image by going to the source of the GitHub folder and then pull it from there.
Yeah, I guess it's the kind of thing that once you start going down that rabbit hole of customization, you're going to be like doing lots of tweaks and stuff. So you won't want to just use one that's just a plugin. You probably want to have your own GitHub or like some way of just keeping track of your changes, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I set mine up ages ago, and I feel I just need to like spend a couple of hours just playing and just seeing how much nicer I can get it.
Oh yeah. For every release or like tweet, I try to change mine. So I'm constantly trying to come up with ways to make it different than my previous ones. And I'm like, oh, what background image do I use now? Or, what color scheme do I use now? So I'm always changing it. And I think last time I did it based on the weather because I was just like, I don't know anymore.
So this is just frustrating because it's an audio podcast, and I feel like I just need to just show the listeners what we're talking about. Some of these themes. I think one of them was like a really retro theme, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that was quite cool.
Yeah.
So if the listeners want to actually just play with Windows Terminal, I think there's a few different ways to install it. I know I've seen it in the Windows Store, and you can also download it on GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right that it's built into Windows 11 too?
Yep. So Windows Terminal Stable comes shipped inside Windows 11. And if you're not on Windows 11, you can install it from the Microsoft Store, GitHub, and you can use Winget or Windows Package Manager and install it from there. And then we also ship another build that's Windows Terminal Preview, which doesn't come installed on Windows, but you can also get that through Microsoft Store, GitHub, and Winget. And that is like a version ahead of the stable version. So that's where all the new features go. So you can play with all the new stuff early. And then we move the preview build into the stable build once a new release comes out and that build has been tested and the bugs have been fixed and all that stuff.
That must have been quite a milestone to actually officially get it in Windows out of the box.
Yeah, that was huge. And, we had to make sure it was small enough because we obviously don't want to take up a ton of room in Windows because people want their storage space. So we had to make sure it was small enough and then, make sure it worked well and had a high reliability and all that. So it was a huge milestone for us, but it's pretty cool to just have it pre-installed. I go and get a preview anyway, but it's cool that it's just there. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that's very cool. So I'm trying to think of like for the listeners that haven't used Windows Terminal or looked at it or anything. And I guess WSL integration is quite interesting where I've got WSL installed. So I've got Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm.
And in my Windows Terminal, when I create a new tab, I've got a drop down where I can choose what shell. So PowerShell, CMD, Bash, or not Bash actually, because it's Windows, but I can choose my WSL distro, my Ubuntu, which will obviously then give me Bash, but it recognizes the fact that I've got WSL installed and I've got an Ubuntu distro installed, and I can just click new tab and choose that shell, and I suddenly get my Ubuntu distro within just another tab within my Windows terminal.
Yeah, so Terminal can support basically any command line application. I think also, I don't know if this still works, but you could put like notepad.exe in the command line. This is not recommended, but it should work in the command line field of a profile, and then it'll just launch Notepad if you click that profile. That's not the way it's intended, but it just like demonstrates that you can launch just about any command line application inside terminal. And then we've just made the WSL support a little bit better so it can auto detect when those shells are installed and will make a profile for you. So you don't have to go and create a new profile, add the path to the executable, and then customize it from there. It just will detect it automatically. And I think it auto detects Visual Studio command line shells as well. So I think there's like a Visual Studio PowerShell and command prompt and stuff. Those get automatically added to terminal when Visual Studio is installed too.
Yeah, that's cool. I think that adds all the various Visual Studio environment variables and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that and paths and things. That's quite nice. So you mentioned about the settings JSON as well, and I know there was a story where it initially started with just the JSON file, but now you've got this UI. Is the UI something is that what you would recommend using? Because I know you can choose between both, and presumably that's still editing the JSON behind the scenes.
Yeah, so the settings UI does directly modify the JSON file in the backend, but the settings UI doesn't have every setting available because some settings are a little bit trickier to represent in a user interface. So, for example, you can have, we call them actions, but you can have an action run when you launch terminal or open a profile, I believe. Actually, no, I believe it's when you launch terminal, the action will run and it can be like open this pane with this profile, open this tab with this profile, split that tab, and then like do these other things. And you can have that all happen at once. But that's not in the settings UI because we were like, oh, do we want just this long text box where you just put this whole command in? Or, we haven't like figured out what the UI should look like for that yet. But that exists in the JSON file. So majority of the features are in the settings UI. So if you're just looking to do some quick customizations and then get started with your terminal, then I'd recommend the settings UI. But if you want literally everything that terminal has, I'd recommend the JSON file.
And does that ever, because I know, and this might have just been a one-time thing, but I know there was a point when the structure of that JSON file changed. So do you often have breaking changes with Windows terminal versions?
I don't know about often. They do come up sometimes, like we'll rename a setting or update a setting from, like, let's say it used to be a Boolean and now it has like 3 or 4 options. But we try to make sure that background compatibility is still okay. So like for the Boolean example, you could still have true and we would just assume the true default of, whatever the options we added were. But I think, and then if we change like a setting name, we try to make sure that that stays compatible as well. But we update our docs every release. So we try to make sure that that's clearly communicated somewhere that a setting is being deprecated or renamed or something. But the ones that we're unsure of their like longevity or existence in general, we'll add the experimental tag before the setting name. So just to convey like, hey, this might just disappear for, whatever reason we decide. So just a heads up, it's an experimental feature. So we try not to break too many people with those kinds of things.
I think, in fairness, I say breaking change, actually, thinking back about it, it might not have even been a breaking change. I think what I did is I took my existing one and then I was quite a few versions behind, and this was in the early days as well. And I did a fresh install and did a diff comparing the two, and the structure had changed quite a lot. But it might have been that Windows Terminal just handled that backwards compatibility. So I don't remember it actually breaking anything. I honestly can't remember. I just remember seeing that the structure of the JSON had changed.
Yeah, I think what we did, because I think I remember when this happened, we added the defaults section into the JSON file. So it used to be like everything was in the root node, and then if you had a profile, it was under the profile node, which is in the root node of the JSON file. But then we added this default section, so then we had to have like defaults, and then also we added like the global section, so you couldn't leave anything just in root anymore. It had to be under globals or defaults or the profiles. So I think that's what it was, and that was a little tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. I think it was something like that where it just changed the like the structure, but even though the actual content of each of the profiles didn't change, it was just the overall structure. But as I say, I can't remember whether it was a breaking change or whether it was just my diff made it look very different. But
yeah.
But that was in the early days anyway, so it seems like super stable and yeah, definitely my go-to CLI tool. In fact, have we spoken at all about the command palette yet? I don't think we have.
Oh, no. So Windows Terminal comes with a command palette, very similar to the one that's in Visual Studio Code. And you can open it with Control-Shift-P. And we also added it to that drop-down menu where you can open different profiles. It's at the bottom. It says command palette. I think we had I don't know, feedback there, and then we changed it to command palette because nobody was clicking that feedback button. And we were like, this is very useful real estate. We should put something more beneficial to people there. But you can have, what's nice with the command palette is that it shows you every action or command you can run in terminal right in this little menu, and then you can execute that action right there in the menu. So that's really handy if you're like, oh, how do I split a pane again? Or oh, let me see what this color scheme looks like really quick. And you can toggle the color scheme. Or there's everything's in there. There's a ton of stuff in there. But that's been a nice feature. And I feel like it really showcases really everything terminal can do because it lists every action, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I find that whole concept of a command palette in, as you say, VS Code, in Windows Terminal, in various other tools I use, because a lot of software seems to be embracing that now, that pattern. And as you say, for discoverability of stuff, you can just Control P or Control Shift P and start typing.
Mm-hmm.
And it just finds that's super useful. And then I think that with hotkeys and stuff, so going back to the settings where you can configure the hotkeys quite a lot, having that discoverability if you can't remember the hotkeys if you get up the command palette.
Yeah, exactly. That's another thing where the settings UI doesn't align 100% to the JSON file. For the actions page, there are actions that you can have other parameters that there's no parameters in the settings UI. It's just the action name itself. Oh, I think there's for example, paste. You can paste without white space or something, or maybe it's copy and you can copy without white space, but adding that flag of without the white space isn't available in the settings UI, but you could do it in the settings.json file. So that's another example where it's not completely one-to-one, but we're working on what does that UI look like, because that's a little trickier to represent, of have these parameters under this command and then this all leads to this key combination. And that's a interesting UI challenge that we're working on.
Yeah, it must be quite difficult. So do you reckon there'll ever be feature parity in the settings versus JSON, or do you reckon you'll always, for some stuff, have to go back into the JSON?
We're aiming to have feature parity. That's one of our top goals, because the settings UI is just more user-friendly and it also provides more discoverability, because in the JSON file, if you're using Visual Studio Code, it's a lot better because they have that IntelliSense feature where we have a JSON schema attached to the JSON file. So if you start typing, you can see all the settings, but that's still a little, I would say that's less discoverable than just a settings UI that shows you everything and it's organized with menus and all these other things. So we're aiming for full parity between the two. We're just actively working on it.
Yeah, it must be tricky, especially if you're building on top of something that was already there.
Mm-hmm.
So with all these settings and themes and everything, say I use multiple machines and I want to sync my settings. Is there any way of doing that? Or would I just have to use the JSON file and put that into Git and store it on GitHub or something?
Yeah. So we used to have roaming, which I believe it roamed across different users on the same machine, I think it was. But then that led to a lot of problems where if you had an Ubuntu profile in your JSON, but then the machine that JSON file went to didn't have Ubuntu installed, the terminal got angry at you and was like, I don't know what this is. So things got a little tricky then. And at that point, we didn't have really good error handling because this was early days. So we removed that functionality and now it's just standalone to the user on the machine. So one way that we're recommending is just have your JSON file or add it to OneDrive, and then you can pull that down onto another machine. That's not the most user-friendly, and we're looking into could we, add it to your Microsoft account or like something like that. But yeah, it's not great when it comes to sharing across devices. It's definitely a manual process.
I guess thinking about your target audience, though, most users of Windows Terminal are either going to be developers or IT people or ops. And they're probably going to be used to maybe, especially developers, using things like Git and things. So I think a lot of developers would find it quite easy to just throw your settings.json into Git. And then you get in the version history as well. So like if that changes over time, you can see what was changed. But as you say, that requires technical knowledge, and it's maybe not that user friendly, but I suppose given your target audience.
Yeah. That's also partly why we were okay having just a JSON file when we first launched, because we figured if you're using the terminal, you're probably aware of how JSON is structured or could easily figure it out. So, yeah.
Cool. I'm trying to think what other features we've missed. Oh, yes, Quake mode.
Oh, yes. Quick mode.
To be honest, I use it sometimes, but then I more often than not accidentally hit the keyboard shortcut that pops it down, and then I get reminded about it and think, that's awesome, I need to start using that again. Then I forget about it because I normally just have Windows Terminal in the background, which I alt-tab between. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I think I can't remember the shortcut now. Is it shit? Let me try it. No? Yeah, so Windows and backtick. And I don't know whether I set that or that's the default, but that basically drops down the terminal on the top half of my screen in Quake console style, which is pretty cool. So I can do the same again and it goes away.
Yeah, that is default, the Windows key backtick. So it should work out of the box like that.
Awesome. I can't think of any other features that, because I use it daily, but those are the main features I use. Is there anything I've missed?
Well, so the thing that we're working on right now is making it the default on Windows. It's a feature for Windows, I would say, but that's kind of where our main focus is at, because I'm like, oh, what are we working on right now? And I'm like, oh, well, we're trying to make it default. So if you type CMD, it'll just open in terminal rather than typing terminal and then going to CMD kind of thing. So you can set this now if you're on Windows 11. You can go into your terminal settings and make terminal the default terminal on Windows. But we're working on making that just be terminal for everybody. That involves a lot of backward compatibility and things. So that's kind of what we're working out, because like console's been around for decades. So there's a lot of stuff that people do with a console window that we didn't necessarily expect. So we're trying to make sure that all those use cases are handled properly before just taking over and making Windows Terminal the default. But that's kind of the thing that we're mostly focused on now. But it is a feature that you could enable today and then just have Terminal just be your regular command line. And it will always launch any command line app into Terminal itself rather than the original window.
Yeah, that's cool. When you first mentioned about the default, I was trying to think what that actually meant, because I kind of like just do Windows and start typing terminal and then enter it. But then if I start typing PowerShell, then you've got that whole blue, completely different experience. So that makes sense. So if I, in Windows 11, with this feature enabled, if I press Windows and type PowerShell, even if I do that, it's going to open up Windows Terminal.
Yep, with your PowerShell profile.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned Cascadia Code earlier as well, and I think we spoke quite a bit about it. Is that also built in now?
Yeah, so I guess it is technically a Windows font because it ships inside Windows Terminal, which ships inside Windows. So in a roundabout way, it is a default included Windows font, which is pretty cool. So that's how it ships in the OS. And also, I believe Visual Studio 2022 ships with Cascadia Code as the default font as well, which is pretty awesome. So it's already included, which is cool. And I know, like what I like to do is set it as my notepad font as well. So anywhere where there's monospaced, I try to make it Cascadia Code.
Yeah, it is very, very nice. Quite a few years ago, I spent quite a bit of time just scouring the internet for different developer fonts. This was quite a few years ago, so this was before Cascadia Code, and eventually found Fira Code, which is then when I discovered ligatures. So that was a very nice font, and it supports ligatures and everything. And when Cascadia Code came out, I couldn't make up my mind, and I was umming back. So I spent like a week in one, and then a week in the other, and I was going backwards and forwards trying to work. Cascadia code did just get the edge, so I've now been using that for the past year or so. But it is very nice. So yeah, hats off to the team that created that. So Windows Terminal future roadmap. Is there any big plans? I know you've already mentioned some things.
Yeah, so the biggest thing on like the forefront for us is making terminal the default. And then we're also working on being able to tear a tab out because the tabs are stuck in that window. You can't pull them out yet because that involves, spinning up a new shell instance and then keeping your buffer history there. There's like a whole bunch of underlying things that have to happen before you can tear a tab out. So that's something we're working on as well. And then the thing that we are hoping to ship in our next release is Mark Mode, which is keyboard selection in the terminal. So right now you can select the text in just the buffer where you're typing, but you can't with your keyboard, but you can't use your keyboard to select like the output of a command, which is actually a huge accessibility issue if you could only use the mouse to do it. So we're hoping to get that in for our next release, which should be the next few weeks. And then that will be in terminal preview, and then we'll test it and everything, and then that'll move into stable. But that's another big one that we are actively working on.
That dragging a tab out, that'd be really nice. But that made me think of being able to drag and reorder tabs. Mm-hmm. And I seem to remember that, well, last time I tried it, you couldn't do this. But while you were talking, I tried it, and you can do that. That's awesome.
Yeah, that came out in 2019. But that one is actually a funny story. So we were at Microsoft Ignite in 2019 down in Orlando, Florida, and we had a booth, and a community member came up to us and he was like, I have tab reordering working on my machine. I've developed it. Can I show you? And can you like help me fix a couple bugs with it? So we're at the booth helping him debug it and fix it. And then he made a pull request like that night or the next night. And then tab reordering came in, but it came in like from Microsoft Ignite, like at the conference, which was pretty cool. So yeah, that's been around for a while, but like reordering tabs, I don't think is like, it's not often done, like unless you're like super organized. So I could see how like you probably wouldn't have even thought to move them around or something. So yeah, but that's the cool story behind that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure I tried it recently. Maybe I just dreamt it, but because another feature you can do, which kind of is related, is if I double click on one of the tabs, I can rename the title. So by default, I'm looking at one now. I've just opened two tabs and it happened to be on my C root directory. So I've got the path in there, but I can double click on any of them and just give it another name. Mm-hmm. And that's something I do quite often. So quite often I would have like a tab with my Docker Compose up with all like Docker services running, and another tab which, as I described before, I would have that other tab as a split screen, one with the front end, one with the back end APIs and that kind of thing. And then I would have another tab which kind of I just run custom commands. So I've got three tabs there. One of them's got a split screen. So I would quite often, the first tab I would actually rename and just call it Docker. Mm-hmm. The second tab I would rename to call whatever the application's called, and then leave the third one just as the default. And I find that just feels a bit cleaner and I can just do that. But quite often, if I open them in a different order, I actually like the idea of being able to drag them and change the order. So I'm glad I've just discovered we can do that.
Yeah.
So actually, I just thought about another feature which is probably worth calling out. So when you're doing stuff on the command line, how you quite often might do a command and then that command's got a really long output, and then you might pipe it to grep to find something in there. In Windows Terminal, you can just do Control-Shift-F and you get the find pop up, and that searches all your buffer, so all the text in there. So that's brilliant. If you've got, like, say, for example, you're writing a command and you do -H for help, and that does the big pages long manual of it, and you can do Control-Shift-F and just find what you want to find rather than having to do grep and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's super useful as well. I think that's everything I can think of. Is there anything we've missed?
I don't think so. I'm looking through it right now. Those are like the big ones for sure.
So shall we do dev picks?
Sure. So my dev pick is what I think is like the best companion to Windows Terminal is Oh My Posh, which is, an open source project and has a ton of customizability and has tons of themes. I've been using it for a few years now, and seeing the theme library just grow to what it is now is pretty awesome. Plus all the extensions or plugins or whatever they're called, that list has grown also. So having all that flexibility, I think, really makes Terminal just super awesome, because Terminal is all about customizability, and that's just another way to do it. So if you want to check it out, it's ohmyposh.dev, and that has where you could set it up, and then documentation on how to customize it and set your theme and all that stuff. So I'm a big fan. That's my dev pick for today.
Well, I'll definitely include a link to all those. And what I might do, actually thinking out loud, in the show notes, some of the different themes and On My Posh terminals and stuff, just to take a whole bunch of screenshots of various different ones that we've seen, and I can just put it in the show notes, because I'm aware audio podcast, it's hard to get it to show how cool these can be without actually some images.
Yeah.
So for my dev pick, I'm actually going to steal one from you, which technically it's not from you, but it's one you shared on Twitter, which so you tweeted about someone called Mike Grease had done, and you tweeted a Windows terminal tip from, and you put at ZADJII, but that's Mike Grease, and you said, add this JSON snippet to your settings.json file to write git commit commands using an action from the command palette. So I'm not going to read out the JSON, obviously, but we'll include a link to that, your tweet, in the show notes. But in your tweet, you also included a really nice animated GIF showing this. And we've already spoken about the command palette, so Control-P, Control-Shift-P. And in your animated GIF, you just typed commit, hit enter, and it typed out git commit minus and then had the quotes and left the cursor inside the quotes. So then from a developer point of view, where you're just wanting to check something in, you can just do Control-Shift-P, commit, or the first few letters of commit, enter, type your commit message, enter, and job's done.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really nice, I know that I pinched that from your tweet, but I thought that was a really nice tip. And on topic too.
Yeah, exactly. And Mike Greasy is one of the developers on Terminal, so he's always coming up with interesting ways to use Terminal too. And what's nice about that action or command that you can do is you can put any command that you often type. So git commit, git push, you can set those as quick key bindings, and it'll just type it into the terminal, and then you could just hit enter, and it's really quick, which is awesome.
That's very cool. As I said before, I feel like I just need to dedicate half a day some point just to hack around with all these kind of stuff and play around with the different themes and with Oh My Posh, which I am using, but I set it up quite a while ago, and I just need to play again and see what else I can do and look around to see what other people have done. So I think I might just dedicate a bit of time to do that one day when I can actually find some spare time. Awesome. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you or the Windows Terminal team if they've got any questions?
So to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter at cinnamon_MSFT. That's also where you could reach out to me for the Terminal team. If you have feature requests or issues that you find or bugs or things like that with Terminal, you can go to our GitHub, which is github.com/Microsoft/terminal. And that's where we take all of our feature requests and do all of the community engagement there.
Fantastic. And I can include a link to all those things in the show notes as well. So so a massive thank you for joining us. As I say, I've been a big fan of Windows Terminal for a while. So just thank you for an awesome product.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me.
You're most welcome. And thank you everyone else for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And of course, we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.